Okay, here's what you need to know about what happened earlier today. Around 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the President of the United States issued a warning that stunned markets and allies alike. He threatened to place 100% tariffs on every single product entering the U.S. from Canada. Not 20%, not 30%, a full 100%. That means the price of Canadian imports would effectively double overnight. And the reason he gave for such an extreme move? Because Canada had just reached an agreement with China. The immediate reaction in Washington was shock, but the real confusion was in Ottawa. Canada is not a rival power. It is not a strategic adversary. It is America's closest ally, its largest trading partner, and the backbone of North American supply chains that have been built over decades. So why threaten the most extreme trade weapon available against a country so deeply integrated with the U.S. economy? To understand that, you have to look beyond tariffs and into timing. The statement did not come after a trade dispute. It did not follow a failed negotiation. It did not arise from months of escalating rhetoric between Washington and Ottawa. It came immediately after news broke that Canada had finalized a new economic and technology cooperation framework with China. On paper, the agreement looked routine: expanded access for Canadian agricultural exports, joint research in battery technology, and new financial channels for cross-border investment. Nothing about it violated any formal alliance obligations. Nothing about it broke any international rules. But in the current geopolitical climate, symbolism matters as much as substance. For the United States, the relationship between its allies and China has become the central fault line of global strategy. Washington is no longer just competing with Beijing. It is trying to limit Beijing's access to advanced technology, secure supply chains, and strategic resources. That effort depends heavily on allied alignment, and Canada sits at a critical intersection of all three. It controls vast reserves of rare earth minerals. It hosts key semiconductor and battery manufacturing investments. It anchors energy flows that feed American industry. From Washington's perspective, any deepening of Canadian economic ties with China is not a neutral commercial decision. It is a potential vulnerability in a containment strategy designed to slow China's rise. This is where the tariff threat becomes less about economics and more about signaling. A 100% tariff is not meant to be implemented. It is meant to be unthinkable. It is a political shockwave designed to communicate one message: alignment is no longer optional. The logic is simple but ruthless. If even Canada can be pressured, no ally is beyond reach. But there is another layer. The domestic political calendar in the United States is tightening. Economic nationalism plays well with voters who are anxious about manufacturing, inflation, and competition from China. Framing a confrontation as defending American industry against foreign influence, even when the immediate target is a close ally, serves a broader narrative. Canada, in this context, becomes a proxy, not the enemy. The message, a warning to Europe, a signal to Asia, and a test of how far alliance loyalty can be stretched when great power competition intensifies. What looks like a bilateral trade dispute is, in reality, a stress test of the entire Western economic system. It asks a single, uncomfortable question: in a world divided between rival power blocks, how much independence can even the closest allies afford? And perhaps more importantly, what price will be demanded for choosing neutrality in a contest that no longer allows it? To see why Canada's China deal triggered such an outsized reaction, you have to understand how Washington now views the global economy, not as a marketplace, but as a battlefield. For decades, trade was about efficiency, growth, and mutual benefit. Supply chains were built wherever costs were lowest and skills were highest. Allies and rivals were economically intertwined in ways that made confrontation expensive and cooperation unavoidable. That world is fading. In its place is a new doctrine: economic security is national security. And in that doctrine, control matters more than profit. The United States is trying to redraw the map of global production. Semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, critical minerals, artificial intelligence, clean energy infrastructure. These are no longer just industries. They are strategic assets. Whoever dominates them shapes the balance of power for the next generation. China understands this. That is why it has spent years locking down mineral supply chains, subsidizing advanced manufacturing, and building parallel financial systems. And it is why it courts not just developing countries, but advanced economies like Canada. From Beijing's perspective, Canada is not just a resource supplier. It is a gateway into the Western technological ecosystem, a partner with credibility, stability, and access to U.S. markets. From Washington's perspective, that is precisely the problem. When Canada signs technology cooperation agreements with China, it creates channels that are difficult to monitor and even harder to control. Research partnerships blur, investment flows mix, supply chains overlap. The clean separation the U.S. is trying to engineer becomes porous. So the tariff threat is not about lumber, steel, or automobiles. It is about leverage. It is about reminding Ottawa that its prosperity is still deeply tied to American market access, that its industries depend on U.S. consumers, U.S. capital, and U.S. regulatory alignment, and that, in a confrontation between superpowers, economic interdependence can be turned into pressure. But this strategy carries risk. Canada is not a small, isolated economy. It is a G7 nation with alternatives. Europe, Asia, and emerging markets all want access to its resources and technology. The more Washington frames loyalty in terms of coercion, the more it forces allies to quietly hedge. That is the paradox. The harder the United States pushes to lock in alignment, the more it reminds partners why diversification feels safer. This is why the 100% tariff threat is so revealing. It shows how far the logic of rivalry has advanced. The language once reserved for adversaries is now being used toward allies. Tools designed for economic warfare are being pointed inward, inside the alliance system itself. And that changes the psychological landscape. Because once economic weapons are normalized within alliances, trust becomes conditional. Cooperation becomes transactional. And every deal with a third party is reinterpreted through the lens of loyalty and defection. Canada's agreement with China may be modest in scope, but its implications are enormous. It exposes a world where the space for strategic neutrality is shrinking, where middle powers are being asked, quietly but firmly, to choose sides, and where even long-standing friendships are being recalibrated. Under the pressure of a new kind of Cold War, one fought not with missiles, but with markets, technology, and access. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that it sits at the intersection of three forces: great power rivalry, economic vulnerability, and domestic politics. In Washington, confronting China has become one of the few areas of rare bipartisan consensus. Different parties may disagree on methods, but not on the diagnosis. Beijing is the central strategic competitor of the 21st century. That consensus creates a political environment where toughness is rewarded, and compromise is easily framed as weakness. When Canada deepens ties with China, it can be portrayed not as pragmatic diplomacy, but as strategic drift. And in a political climate driven by headlines and sound bites, nuance disappears. A 100% tariff threat becomes a performance as much as a policy. It signals resolve to domestic audiences. It tells voters that the administration is willing to use the full weight of American economic power to defend national interests. The target, in this case, is almost secondary. What matters is the demonstration of force. But performances have consequences. Once the language of coercion is used, expectations are set. Backing down later can look like retreat. Escalating further can lock leaders into paths that are economically damaging, but politically difficult to abandon. For Canada, the dilemma is acute. If it yields publicly to U.S. pressure, it reinforces a hierarchy within the alliance system. Washington decides, others comply. That may preserve short-term stability, but erodes long-term autonomy. If it resists, even quietly, it risks becoming a test case, a signal of how much independence a middle power can actually exercise in a polarized world. This is where China's role becomes subtle but significant. Beijing does not need to provoke. It does not need to boast. It only needs to watch. Every time the United States pressures an ally over China, it strengthens a narrative Beijing has been cultivating for years, that American leadership is conditional, that partnerships come with strings, and that sovereignty is constrained by alignment. The more visible the pressure, the more persuasive that narrative becomes, especially in countries that already fear being caught between rival blocs. So the real audience of the tariff threat is not just Ottawa. It is Brussels. It is Tokyo. It is Seoul. It is every capital weighing how closely to align with Washington, while maintaining economic ties with Beijing. The message is stark. Strategic ambiguity has a cost. Yet the cost of full alignment is also rising. Decoupling from China is expensive. Supply chains are complex. Markets are interlinked. For many countries, cutting ties is not an option. At best, they can rebalance, diversify, and slow the pace of integration. This is the narrow path Canada is trying to walk. Cooperate with the United States on security. Engage China on trade and technology. Avoid turning economic policy into a zero-sum loyalty test. The tariff threat suggests that this balance is becoming harder to sustain. It reveals a shift from persuasion to pressure, from coordination to enforcement. And once that shift begins, it rarely stops at one case. It becomes a precedent, a reminder that in an era of strategic competition, even friendships are measured against alignment, and even economic decisions are judged as political acts. What happens next will determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or just another warning shot in a long economic confrontation. If the tariff threat is quietly walked back, it will be remembered less as a policy and more as a signal, a reminder that in the new geopolitical climate, alliances come with expectations that are no longer negotiable. Canada may be reassured in public, but the message will already have been delivered. Deep strategic engagement with China now carries political consequences, even for the closest of partners. If, however, the pressure escalates, the implications are far more serious. A real trade war between the United States and Canada would not look like past disputes over lumber or steel. It would hit integrated supply chains and energy, automobiles, food, and critical minerals. It would raise prices on both sides of the border, slow growth, and inject instability into a North American economy that is supposed to be the anchor of Western resilience. And beyond economics, it would fracture something more delicate: trust. Alliances survive not only on shared interests, but on the belief that partners will not be treated as instruments. Once that belief erodes, coordination becomes harder and unity becomes conditional. For China, the situation is strategically convenient, not because it gains immediately from Canadian trade, but because it benefits from the visible strain within the Western camp. Every dispute, every threat, every moment of coercion reinforces the idea that the U.S.-led order is becoming more rigid, more demanding, and less tolerant of independent decision-making. Beijing does not need to say this. Others will conclude it on their own. For middle powers like Canada, the world is narrowing. They are too large to be ignored, too integrated to be neutral, and too exposed to choose without consequences. The era when economic policy could be separated from strategic alignment is ending. Trade agreements, investment flows, even research partnerships are being reclassified as security choices. And once that happens, the room for maneuver shrinks dramatically. The threat of 100% tariffs is therefore not just about one deal, one country, or one moment. It is about the transformation of the global system itself, a system where pressure replaces persuasion, where loyalty is tested through markets, where economic tools are wielded with the logic of power politics. And in that system, the question is no longer who trades with whom. The question is who is allowed to choose. History rarely announces itself with declarations or treaties. It reveals itself in moments when familiar relationships begin to change shape. A threat made, a line tested, an ally reminded of the cost of standing between giants. If you want to understand those moments before they become chapters in history books, before they harden into a new world order, then stay with this channel, because the most important shifts in power are often the quiet ones. And by the time they become obvious, the choices are already gone.